Today, we are diving into a document that raises a disturbing question. Has the $500 drone made the $10 million tank completely obsolete? Welcome to a new Strategic Labs deep dive. Check the links in the description. So, the submitted material is a video script exploring how cheap FPV drones and commercial semiconductors are fundamentally upending traditional armored warfare. And we're going to dive right into the feedback here.
Yeah, jumping right into it. I mean, reading through this, the author clearly possesses a really deep expertise in military analysis. The writing itself is, highly engaging.
Oh, absolutely. It's really well researched.
It's punchy, right? The hooks are excellent and the pacing is just incredibly sharp. So because of that high level of proficiency, we are going to completely skip the basic structural edits today.
Right. No grammar nitpicks or anything like that today.
Exactly. Instead, we are going to focus entirely on high-level logical robustness, resolving internal narrative contradictions and really maximizing the script's authoritative weight for an expert audience. We want to take this from being a highly watchable video script to an unassailable piece of strategic analysis.
So getting into that, the financial comparison between a, $500 drone and a $10 million tank, it provides this incredibly compelling hook. But the underlying economic analysis really needs to account for broader systemic costs to be truly unassailable.
Yeah, that dynamic is kind of the foundational pillar of the script. And the weakness here is that the material currently treats the FPV drone as an isolated standalone weapon, right?
Right, just operating in a total vacuum.
Exactly. It calculates this financial guillotine purely on a unit-to-unit basis. It looks at a $400 to $1,000 piece of plastic and explosives and just weighs it directly against a $10 million Abrams.
And then just declares an immediate financial victory for the drone.
Right, which, it creates a striking visual for a YouTube thumbnail, but it completely isolates the munition from the actual environment required to deploy it.
Right, the script just completely overlooks the massive, expensive, and really entirely invisible kill chain that is required to make that $500 drone effective in the first place.
Oh, 100%. By ignoring the systemic costs of, continuous ISR intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance drone coverage, satellite communication networks, specialized operator training.
Not to mention the incredibly high failure rate.
Yes, exactly. Drones lost to electronic jamming. By ignoring all of that, the financial attrition argument just leaves itself open to easy dismantling. Defense experts watching this will instantly know that a military isn't just paying for the single drone that happens to hit the target.
Right. They are paying for the entire digital and logistical ecosystem that enabled that singular hit.
Yeah, and taking that a step further, an FPV drone operator wearing goggles cannot spot a tank 10 kilometers away on their own. They just can't.
No, they rely on a larger observation drone loitering at a much higher altitude to even find the target.
And that observation drone is beaming coordinates through a multi-million-dollar commercial satellite constellation, like Starlink or whatever, down to a command post.
Which then feeds the data directly to the strike operator.
Right, so the suggestion to the author here is to evolve that new battlefield economy argument from a simplistic, cheap versus expensive dichotomy into a much more sophisticated framework.
Like a distributed networks versus concentrated assets kind of framing.
Exactly that. Distributed networks versus concentrated assets. So instead of comparing one tank to one drone, the script should compare the cost of fielding a heavy armored brigade against the cost of sustaining a vast continuous portfolio of digital assets and expendable munitions.
So how do they put that into practice, like concrete examples?
Well, the author needs to explicitly acknowledge that invisible infrastructure early on. Just add a specific line clarifying that while the explosive drone itself is only $500, the multi-million-dollar constellation of commercial satellites and the overlapping umbrella of observation drones are, mandatory prerequisites.
Right, just for that drone to even function. And they also need to address the attrition rate, right?
Yeah. The modern battlefield is heavily saturated with signal interference. So to achieve one successful strike, an operator might burn through a dozen drones that just fall out of the sky because they get neutralized by electronic warfare.
It is rarely a clean one-to-one exchange.
Never. So the financial victory shouldn't be framed as the cost of the final munition, but rather the cost to sustain the entire digital network versus the industrial network.
But wait, Here's the catch. With complicating that calculation from a storytelling perspective, I mean, the $500 versus $10 million contrast is the golden hook of this entire piece, right?
It really is.
It is the very concept that stops a viewer from scrolling past the video. So if the author introduces all this nuanced invisible infrastructure cost, satellites, EW losses, operator training, is there a risk that focusing on those systemic costs might accidentally dilute the shock value of that hook?
That is a very real tension in this kind of writing. But the solution isn't to hide the nuance, it is to use the systemic nuance to actually validate the hook.
Okay, how so?
Well, the author should absolutely still use the $500 figure to grab attention in the opening seconds. It remains a factually true number for the munition itself, but once the viewer is listening, the script must reveal the systemic reality to build long-term credibility.
Because if a creator just says, cheap drone kills expensive tank, a casual viewer might be amazed, but a military professional just rolls their eyes.
Exactly, because they know warfare is vastly more complicated. So by pivoting and saying, well, the munition is $500, but the invisible web of technology required to guide it is vastly more complex, the author proves to the expert audience that they truly understand modern attritional war.
They keep the initial shock value, but they earn the respect of the analyst.
Exactly. And because that invisible kill chain is so complex to maintain, it actually completely reframes the core narrative of the author's script.
Which brings us to a major structural friction point.
Right, the script's dramatic assertion that armor is obsolete creates a pretty jarring logical contradiction when it later admits that tanks are not actually disappearing.
Yeah, the weakness really lies in how the narrative aggressively contradicts itself. In the opening hooks and throughout Block 2, which the author has literally titled The Death of Superior Armor, the script explicitly claims the complete collapse of armored doctrine.
It states in no uncertain terms that the age of the tank is over. Right. But then, when the viewer reaches Block 4, the script directly contradicts this earlier fatalism. It states, heavy armor still provides necessary mobility, and tanks are not disappearing, and then it introduces electronic warfare as the new armor.
It causes a real whiplash for the audience. I mean, the first half feels highly sensationalized, making this definitive, absolute claim about the end of a military era.
And then the second half feels like a rapid retreat from that very premise. It weakens the overall thesis because the viewer starts to question if the initial hook was just clickbait.
So, the suggestion here is to reframe the overarching narrative. Frame it not as the sudden death of the tank, but as the forced, desperate evolution of the tank.
I really like that framing. The author can use Block 4's electronic warfare concepts to fundamentally pay off the tension built in the earlier sections, rather than using it to backtrack on their own hook.
And we really need to look at the how and why of electronic warfare to understand just how desperate this evolution actually is.
Right. Strapping a digital jamming bubble onto a 40-ton steel behemoth creates immense mechanical and logistical friction.
Because tanks were originally engineered to power a heavy turret, an autoloader, a massive diesel engine.
They were never designed to generate the massive continuous electrical power required to blast broadband jamming frequencies in a dome around the vehicle.
That is the exact mechanism the script needs to highlight.
Yeah, when you bolt an EW system onto a tank, the alternators fry. The electrical systems overheat. It is a desperate patch, a duct tape solution applied in the field, not a comfortable cure.
So by explaining why EW integration is so physically taxing on the vehicle, the author proves that the tank is in crisis, even if it isn't literally dead.
Exactly.
Thinking about this tension between heavy physical armor and cheap new technology, it immediately brings to mind the crisis the battleship faced during the rise of naval aviation.
That's a brilliant historical analogy.
Right? For decades, from Jutland all the way into the early days of the Second World War, the dreadnought battleship was the undisputed king of the ocean. The logic was simple. The thicker the armor and the bigger the guns, the better the ship.
But then aircraft carriers matured.
Exactly. Suddenly, cheap fracking torpedo bombers and dive bombers were dropping payloads from the sky, striking the unarmored wooden decks. Battleships didn't vanish overnight in 1941.
No, but they could no longer operate independently.
Right. They went from being the apex predator of the sea to being a vulnerable asset that required an entirely new ecosystem of protection. They needed a massive, invisible umbrella of combat air patrols and radar picket destroyers just to survive crossing an ocean.
Incorporating an analogy like that would completely bridge the gap in the script between the ideas that tanks are dead and tanks need EW.
If the author includes that historical parallel, it tells the audience that military history has seen this exact paradigm shift before.
It proves that a dominant weapon system can lose its unquestioned supremacy without disappearing from the battlefield completely. The tank's physical steel is no longer enough to operate independently, just like the battleship steel wasn't enough.
It requires an electronic umbrella now. So, let's look at the concrete examples for how the author can execute this reframing on the page. First, adjust the heading of Block 2. Instead of titling it, The Death of Superior Armor, change it to something like The Vulnerability of Steel or The End of Unquestioned Armor.
Right, that maintains an ominous, dramatic tone without making a definitive claim that has to be walked back later.
Additionally, in the conclusion, the author should explicitly state something like, the tank isn't dead, but the 20th century way we deploy it absolutely is.
And when presenting the electronic warfare section in Block 4, do not present it as a safety net. Present it as that desperate, rapid adaptation we just discussed. Emphasize that adding a power-hungry digital jamming bubble fundamentally changes what a tank is.
Because it can no longer just be a physical fortress, it is being forced to become a digital fortress, and it is struggling to adapt to that role.
Exactly. And reconciling that internal contradiction will do wonders for the script's credibility. But we also need to address how these arguments are physically sequenced.
Yes, the current sequencing of the blocks creates a disruptive whiplash effect by jumping abruptly between tactical battlefield realities and global geopolitical supply chains.
Structurally, this is probably the most significant opportunity for improvement in the entire draft. The weakness is that the flow of the argument constantly breaks the reader's immersion.
Right. Right now, Block 2 discusses the highly tactical, gritty reality of vertical warfare.
It explains how drones are maneuvering precisely to hit the physical vulnerabilities of the tank's glacis plate, the heavily armored front slope of the hull, or dropping munitions straight down into open hatches.
So the viewer is right there in the mud, looking through the static-filled camera of the drone.
Exactly. But then, Block 3 suddenly pulls the viewer out of the trench and drops them into a boardroom in Shenzhen to discuss global commercial supply chains, rare earth metals, and the macro-level semiconductor war.
And then immediately after that massive geopolitical detour, Block 4 snaps the focus right back down to the dirt to discuss localized electronic warfare protecting individual tanks.
It's like watching the movie with incredibly jarring editing. You cut from a claustrophobic close-up of a knife fight to a wide drone shot of a political summit, and then instantly back to the knife fight.
The erratic bouncing between macro and micro levels prevents the script from building any continuous escalating momentum.
So the suggestion here is to reorganize the blocks to create a seamless, continuous zoom-out effect. The author should move the listener from the immediate, granular tactical reality of a single tank engagement steadily upward, ending on the grand strategic and geopolitical implications, without ever breaking that visual continuity.
Okay, so how do we restructure that sequence to maintain the momentum?
Well, group the tactical blocks together first. The script should flow from Block 1, which establishes the cost asymmetry of the drone versus the tank.
Right, the $500 versus $10 million.
Yes, and that flows naturally into Block 2, which covers vertical warfare, the glacis plate, and exactly how that cheap drone kills the expensive tank.
Got it. And from there?
From there, do not go to China. Go directly into Block 4, the tactical response, which is electronic warfare.
Oh, that makes so much more sense. That keeps the viewer entirely grounded in the immediate battlefield reality. First, the tank is cheap to hit. Second, here is the physical mechanism of how they hit it. Third, here is how the tank crew tries to defend themselves on the ground using EW jammers.
Exactly. Once you have established that tactical baseline, that surviving in the mud now requires a digital EW bubble, you have built a perfect pivot point. After explaining the desperate need for EW systems, the author can use a transition like, but surviving this tactical nightmare requires an entirely new kind of industrial base.
That's a really clean transition. You use that pivot to organically zoom out to Block 3, the semiconductor war and Chinese component supply chains.
Yeah, the underlying logic becomes perfectly linear. The tank needs EW to survive the drone. The EW system requires advanced microchips. Therefore, the nation that controls the microchips controls the survival of the tank.
Ultimately, the current draft concludes with Block 5, the end of Blitzkrieg and the new geopolitical reality. Restructuring it this way smooths out the narrative ramp beautifully. You start in the mud and end in the stratosphere.
It's much, much better.
But looking at that revised structure, I actually want to challenge the author's intended ending entirely.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Block 3, the semiconductor war, is currently positioned as a stepping stone. If we move it to the latter half of the video, right before the final conclusion about Blitzkrieg, it gains a lot of weight.
Right, it does.
But what if making the semiconductor war the climactic final point of the entire essay would leave a much more haunting impression on the viewer? I mean, is ending on the end of Blitzkrieg actually ending on a 20th century concept, when the whole point of this script is to usher in the 21st century?
Wow, that is a fascinating provocation. If you end on the semiconductor war, do you drift too far away from the military hardware that the audience clicked on the video to see? Perhaps?
But the script's core thesis is that the foundation of military power is permanently transitioning from heavy industrial steel to adaptable technological ecosystems.
That's true. If the author ends on Blitzkrieg, they are still centering the tank. They are defining the future of war by what is currently being lost. But if they make the semiconductor war the absolute climax of the piece, they are defining the future by what is actually taking over.
It forces the viewer to confront the terrifying irony of modern supply chains, the realization that commercial gaming console tech, or, a microchip designed for a smart washing machine, is now dictating the survival of a multi-million-dollar armored vehicle.
It really leaves a viewer with this unsettling realization that the tactical drone explosions they are watching on their screens are actually just the first sparks of a much larger global industrial-scale semiconductor conflict.
Exactly. It expands the scope of the video from a localized battlefield analysis to a massive global warning.
I strongly encourage the author to experiment with that specific ending. Keep the zoom-out effect continuous. Go from the physical vulnerability of the open hatch to the drone hovering above it, to the invisible EW spectrum fighting it, and finally, end the entire script on the silicon chips that dictate who wins and who loses the next decade of warfare.
It is a profoundly powerful way to structure an argument, and it rewards the viewer for sticking around until the very end.
Absolutely.
So let's do a brief recap of the core takeaways from today's analysis so the author has a clear roadmap for their next draft. First, deepen the economic thesis by factoring in the systemic kill chain costs. The drone itself is cheap, but the invisible infrastructure keeping it in the sky, the satellites, the loitering ISR networks, the specialized training, it's incredibly expensive and complex.
Right. Second, resolve the death of armor contradiction by reframing it. The tank isn't dead, it is just being forced into a desperate, mechanically taxing digital evolution.
And third, restructure the blocks to flow smoothly, moving sequentially from the micro-tactics of the battlefield to the macro-geopolitics of global supply chains.
For the actionable summary, the author should remember to explicitly mention the immense power generation problems of strapping EW to an alternator designed for a diesel engine. Tweak the phrasing around the obsolescence of tanks, maybe utilizing that battleship and naval aviation analogy you brought up to maintain analytical credibility and avoid contradicting your own hook.
And finally, reorder Block 4 so it sits directly before Block 3. That gives the script a clean, escalating narrative that pulls the viewer steadily upward into the semiconductor discussion.
We would be absolutely thrilled to see how these structural edits take shape. Please submit your next draft or any future military analysis projects you are working on back to the critique for another round of feedback. Your grasp of doctrine is fantastic, and with these refinements, your arguments will be entirely bulletproof.
We've reached the end of this analysis. If this added value, please like and subscribe to Strategic Labs. See you next time.